And Rahima, you've been living in London actually almost for 2 decades, partly because you can't go back to where you're from and where your family is. And I know that must be really vexing and trying for you. It's a hard time. You can't communicate with your family members. And in some of the materials that I read, especially your first person account, you seem to divide the repression that has happened to Uyghurs and your family members and people you know into two parts. That after the Cultural Revolution in 1976, mosques reopened, there was relative freedom. And then after Tiananmen Square, there was a change. So describe in your view what's happened in terms of the change and the repression that's come upon your folks.
Thank you very much for having me. I remember in my childhood, my father and my brothers, they prayed. They had to lock the gate from inside the house and often warned me and other siblings that do not tell other people that we prayed. That was before the 80s, 1980s. So I remember then towards the end of, I think I was year 1 or year 2, started my primary school, and things changed. The mosques were opened and people extremely happy that for Muslims it is such a big thing, especially a kind of religious family like mine. And so that's why I say that from maybe the 1980 to 1989, these 9 years were kind of golden years after the Cultural Revolution, that people suffered so much. And, the labor camps, people were taken into labor camps. We have songs called the Tarim. It's about a labor camp as well. So then 1989, the student movement, the new leadership, that it started to deteriorate countrywide and also in my country. I call it East Turkestan.
And so was the labor repression, was that evident from the very beginning? In other words, where your people were repressed by the Chinese government for religious reasons, but then they used folks in forced labor camps in order to essentially feed the supply chains of global corporations. Was that always true, or is that a more recent development as far as you can tell?
No, actually, since the CCP occupied East Turkestan 1949, from the in 1955, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region was actually declared, but they have never honored that agreement, autonomous region agreement. Then from 1958, the rightist movement started, then targeting the rich, wealthy, and during the Cultural Revolution, it's not just target the Uyghurs, that was the all countrywide movement targeting intellectuals and business people. So anyone really that the governments or authorities didn't like, they took them and they sent them to camps. They at that time, it is either called reform through labor. So they had these sort reforms. But for now, since 2016 and 17, specifically from April 2017, this large internment started, primarily targeting the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. And later we learned, only I think from the end of 2018 and last year, that actually a lot of Uyghurs who were interned sent to these factories to work as a slave labor. Yeah.
And so let's bring Brian into the conversation. Brian, this seems like very familiar territory for those of us who have watched international labor rights over many years. You've got these massive global supply chains, these big companies essentially exploiting low-wage labor. And China is not a mystery to us. This has been happening for a long, long time. What has changed, or what do you see as different with the repression of the Uyghurs from certainly a religious standpoint, and how that's being used now to supply companies like, and I'm reading from a report that was put out by in Congress, you've got Adidas, Calvin Klein, Coca-Cola, Costco, H&M, Kraft Heinz, Nike, Patagonia. You've got all these big name brands essentially exploiting those workers there for their production purposes, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the global supply chains of all the companies you named and any major company and some even smaller ones extend everywhere. So companies have quite deliberately gone to places where there is often at best a governance gap, where the government isn't doing things to prevent, horrible labor conditions. We've seen this over decades, even before they had far-flung supply chains. We had the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York. That was a supply chain. Fire killing over 100 in 1911. And in 1991, you have a poultry factory in North Carolina where, governance gaps happen. They always have happened. I think the difference is companies have quite deliberately gone to places where they know there are governance gaps, or they know that the government actually does much worse than not be present. Government in places that forces people to labor. And I think the question of the Uyghur region, this part of China has just been very important for the production of certain supply chain issues. I mean, they say that 1 out of 5 cotton shirts in the world has some cotton from this region. And the political and cultural pieces that Rahima talked about really just, companies go in there, they know, and they have ways of managing risk. And we can go into more detail about that, but
sure,
their interest is risk management, whether it's reputational or legal. And there are real legal problems. There are violations of US law and other countries' laws. So companies go in and then they put together these systems where they say, oh, well, we will be vigilant. We will try and make sure the worst things don't happen. But that thing called human rights due diligence is absolutely impossible in this part of China. And I would argue in most places in China for certain issues like freedom of association, it's completely impossible to do human rights due diligence.
And you mentioned cotton production in East Turkestan. From what I read, 84% of China's cotton production comes just from that region, that then translates into the apparel imports that come into the United States from China and obviously other places in the world. So there really is this global production system that we've seen, as you pointed out, Brian, in China for a very long time. And so to your point, Brian, about risk reduction, or the way in which companies analyze risk, this is their perfect storm in some way, because when you have a region that's under the thumb of an authoritarian government and they're putting people in internment camps, you can't get any better, and I'm being sarcastic about this, you can't get any better in terms of controlling a workforce than that, right?
And at the same time, they have these commitments that they've made through their own codes, through international agreements with the ILO and the UN, all of these sort of half measures that are not quite law. They're statements of standards that are then sort of held up as, we don't tolerate forced labor, but they go into places where they cannot, even if they wanted to, they couldn't do authentic worker interviews and workplace visits with knowing that the workers are able to talk honestly and frankly. And even the State Department, at the beginning of this month, July 1st, released a business advisory. And one of the points that they buried a bit, but they said in very clear language, usual human rights due diligence, going in there and trying to make sure that the worst things aren't happening. It's not really possible to do that in this repressive region. The problem is that they turn around and then say, so do human rights due diligence. And we're saying, you just said it doesn't work there. You got to do something else. And what we're calling for is exit responsibly.
Okay, so let's now move to what Rahima and you are working on in terms of the call to action. Rahima, let's start with you. What is it that the global community needs to do in terms of, I assume, pressuring the corporate world, these supply chains, to basically make sure that this internment, this oppression, this repression of people ends, or as it at least begins, as Brian pointed out, there's some ability to monitor how the workplace looks in those internment camps and in that forced labor situation.
Well, in a kind of simple way, I would say when the product couldn't sell, when they couldn't sell the products, when the less companies, a business interested in getting them, that actually will have a very powerful impact on, China's economy itself. And maybe that will push the behavior of the Chinese authority. That's the best we can bet here. And therefore, I mean, the business community up until now, we didn't really hear them taking any actions, from small companies to big companies. And as you said, cotton product, 84% coming from East Turkestan. And we know from the cotton picking, the forced labor is involved. Therefore, if we could convince these big brands that stop getting their products from these the supply chains that is actually using the forced labor, that might make a difference.
And it's a hard situation to manage, because if you look around the world, there have been attempts, for example, to change the conditions in places like Bangladesh, where there were these terrible fires and there were accords made with these suppliers, these big brands. And all they seem to have done is shift their production or figure out other places to go, for example, to East Turkestan. And the names Nike come up again and Apple come up again. They've been already caught using slave labor and low-wage labor both in China and other places in the world. So it's almost like, if I can use that term, the whack-a-mole situation. You're trying to grab them and control them, but really at the end of the day, it's in some way the system. It's capitalism. They're going to find other places, and it's in particularly a problem in China in an authoritarian regime where you can't do, for example, surprise inspections. You can't just land in a country and come to a factory and make sure conditions are better or adhered to, right, Brian?
Yeah.
Challenge.
It's even in the better situations, or even the best of situations, the corporate-driven ways of doing due diligence, that is audits, inspections, these are always flawed because they are corporate-driven, and you don't have actual worker-driven responsibility of the corporation. So when you go into a place like this part of China or China at large, you can't do those programs, which are always flawed. So what we're calling on the companies to do is at least stop profiting by this forced labor. And I want to back up to something you said very quickly. We're not just talking about, garment imports from China. The fact is that China exports a lot of this cotton, and it exports it to places like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia. So it is a whack-a-mole situation. So part of what we're calling on the companies to do is know your supply chain, show your supply chain, and clean up that supply chain. So if the company says, okay, we're not going to bring garments from China or from this part of China, from East Turkestan, that's good, that's a step, but where is that cotton going? Are you buying from a producer in Bangladesh that has got the same cotton? So it is complicated, but it can be done. And I think that that's what we're calling on is, you talk about the Triangle Fire, you talk about the Rana Plaza factory collapse. These are events that suddenly brought to light systematic injustice. What we have here is over 3 years of systematic rounding up people, putting them involuntarily in jobs, sometimes in camps, sometimes making them move to different parts, thousands of miles away from their country, from their homeland. So this is it's a slow burn or a slow systematic way of operating that it's time for the companies to step up and say, we can't do our due diligence here. So we're going to find other places to get this material and source from elsewhere.
And Rahima, what these companies are doing, obviously, in addition to repressing folks, Uyghurs in the area in East Turkestan in terms of wages and horrible labor conditions, it's also essentially assaulting their community and their culture and the whole way in which people have lived there, right?
Absolutely. And only in March, a friend of mine living in Turkey sent me a message about a young man who was picked up from Khotan, from his home. And then he was summoned to go to a local school. And when he went there, there were already like hundreds of Uyghur youth. This was at the peak of the coronavirus lockdown in China as well. Everywhere were closed, and 1,000 Uyghur youth, just that one day.
Mm-hmm.
And they were assembled about 1,000 from two regions, from Khotan and from Kashgar, these two most Uyghur populated regions. And they were stayed in this school overnight, and March, it was cold. They were not provided any beddings or anything. And then the next morning they were taken to train station, and they arrived overnight at Urumqi. Then again they stayed in a large hall. Then they were separated in like 5 to 10 in one group, and the buses just picked them up and took them to various different factories. And these people didn't know where they were going. They were not people who locked up in camps.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the police actually came to inform the family about that 2 days later, he is going to move to somewhere else. So the mother questioned the police, said, my son has a job here. And a police said, no, this is the order from the above.
And do they have any contact with people who are then transported? I assume this is a long way away, right? Is it hundreds of miles away from where they were from and where they lived?
Yes, yeah. But he ended up in a factory, drink factory, 3 days later. He didn't know where he was taken. And he said, I don't know, apart from 9 of us, we are now here. The rest we don't know. They even close friends, they don't know where they were taken.
And to make the obvious point, both to Rahima and Brian, one of the problems is in China generally, you don't have independent unions. You don't have the ability to organize those people who are not just in this situation, but generally speaking, workers who can stand up to this regime. There is no independent union movement in China.
Well, that's why the AFL-CIO for decades has been pointing out the many problems of violations of human rights and labor rights. And the fact that corporations can go in with their corporate codes and say, we've audited and we've inspected, and we say that they are meeting freedom of association requirements or standards, it's ludicrous, but they find a way to do it, and they find cooperative organizations and multi-stakeholder initiatives. And it's really just whitewashing a problem we've known about for decades. But this case is so egregious, and it is across sectors. We're talking garment and cotton here right now, but you've mentioned Apple, the Australian report that I think you saw.
Yep.
Makes
Coca-Cola.
Yes, I think Heinz ketchup. There's a lot of tomato production and exports there as well. But we just happen to have, the fact of so much of the cotton, 1 out of 5 shirts, 86% of the Chinese cotton, and a pretty well-organized group of human rights, labor rights, and unions who follow garment, because garment is a sector where you see this in the whack-a-mole fashion you described. It moves around.
Here's a challenge that I throw to both of you and ask you how you navigate this moment in time of criticizing China rightly for the way in which it's repressing workers generally and Uyghurs in East Turkestan, and the global reality that China at least from the United States, is being attacked in relation to the coronavirus. You see Donald Trump using tremendous amounts of racism targeting China. So it must be a fine line, or at least a very important contrast, or you have to be subtle about pointing out that obviously you don't embrace and aren't trying to articulate this racist language that Donald Trump is using towards China. But there are real serious issues about the authoritarian regime, which is really serving global corporations. This isn't about communism versus capitalism. It's about capitalism being in some way enforced on people in China.
Well, I imagine Rahima could say a lot about this, but I'll just quickly say that.
Yeah, let's let each of you comment about that. Go ahead, Brian.
So it's really been important for us, first of all, to make clear, and this will become clear when we have the public call to action next week, or the 23rd. This is a global coalition. This is not just about, what the AFL-CIO or U.S. workers or U.S. organizations think. This is global. This is it's consistent with, things like forced labor and anti-trafficking principles that are things that we've been talking about and denouncing for a long time in China and anywhere. So we are very consistent and on long record on this, and that's the first thing. And I would say that the fact is that a lot of companies know that there's a problem, and there are some who are already working on leaving. But I think what we'll see is they might not want to say what they're doing because China is for them also a market. So this is, again, the capitalist system that not only tolerates some things that you say you're against, but don't even say anything even if you're acting against those things because you're concerned about a market.
What's your view about this, Rahima? How do you pose those two and say to the world, this isn't about attacking China and being racist in the Donald Trump way, but there is a reality that people, more than 1 million people, are being repressed and forced into internment camps for really the goal of making profits for big companies?
Yes, call to action itself, it's very clear our target. We are not targeting the Chinese people, not even the Chinese country as a whole. We are not asking boycott China, for example. We are our message is very, very clear. It's very fair. So another thing for me encouraging is this is actually since the 2017, the atrocities have been happening. Actually, maybe one of the first global movements, this call to action, having this so many coalitions come together and calling for action. So this actually also is a comfort for the Uyghurs, because we felt the world has been silent for so long. Not only just the government, also the civil society as well. So I think this is a very important move. I will say this is a start.
Well, this call to action is coming out tomorrow, and on this show we will continue to talk about it and cover it. And Rahima and Brian, please feel free to come back on the show and give us an update on how the movement is going to hold these global corporations accountable and not let them essentially pocket these profits at the expense of Uyghurs, the people who are in these enforced internment camps. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your interest in inviting us.